Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study, and I'm pleased to be here with you today. Thank you very much for joining us today. You know, all the way back on the 2nd of October, 2021, we began a new study series that I called The Pentateuch, A New Look. And in that, according to the name, we're taking a different approach, a closer look at the 5 books. We've been working through according to the annual cycle of Torah readings, and according to that cycle of Torah readings, next week, those who follow the annual cycle of Torah readings will be entering into Deuteronomy. Of course, in the land of Israel, they enter Deuteronomy this week. So what I did last week, just to kind of welcome those of you who are new to the Saturday morning scripture study, I combined the material that wraps up or ends the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, as it's called in Hebrew. I did 2 in 1 last week, which gave me a 1-week space between the end of the book of Numbers and the beginning of my cycle of teachings on the book of Deuteronomy. And the purpose of that was because I wanted to give myself 1 week to sort of give an introduction, to tell you sort of what we're going to do and to prepare you for what's coming. Now, I can tell you right now that the book of Deuteronomy, if you don't know this, you probably haven't listened to me for very long, but the book of Deuteronomy is my favorite book in all of the Hebrew Bible and the whole Tanakh. It's my favorite, first of all, in the 5 books. I like it better than Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Some people might think you can't have favorites, but I have to tell you, I'm being honest, Deuteronomy is my favorite. But even beyond the Pentateuch, I tend to like Deuteronomy best of all the books of the Hebrew Bible. And I think that will be obvious by the enthusiasm, if you will, of my teaching over the next several weeks. Now, I do want to say at the outset that I want you to be prepared to be challenged. And what I mean by that is not by me so much. I know a lot of people might associate the challenges that we face with me as a teacher, but it's not with me. The challenge is with the text itself. I promise you that you will be challenged by the text of the Bible, and not me. So here we are, beginning a new series on the book of Deuteronomy. This is my introductory class. I plan to give you some examples of some things, and primarily what I'm going to focus on is that Deuteronomy is different. Deuteronomy is vastly different, more different than you might suppose as we enter into this study. So be prepared for that. The name Deuteronomy comes from the Greek via the Latin, the way the English reads Deuteronomy. It means really second law. In the Hebrew, it would be Mishneh HaTorah. So I want to begin with the reason for the wrong name. The reason for the wrong name. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 17 this morning. Some of you are already looking for the X out of this button, but hang with me. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 18. It says, when he, this is talking about the monarch, the king, when he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written before him or for him on a scroll by the Levitical priest. So this is saying that a copy of this teaching, HaTorah Hazot, as it says in Hebrew, the Torah, often translated law, it's better translated instruction. So a copy of this instruction. Now in Hebrew, that's Mishneh HaTorah Hazot, a copy of this teaching. And because of that, and the Greek, deutero means a second or a copy, and nomos is law. So this idea was picked up very early on, and people began to associate the book of Deuteronomy with being a copy or a repetition, if you will, of something else. So in other words, most or many believe, even today, whether they're Jewish or Christian or coming at it from an academic and non-religious standpoint, they consider this book to be nothing really revelatory in the sense of new material, but rather that the book itself is a repetition of a large part of laws and history that we already know. We've already read this. Like you'll notice as you read Deuteronomy, people a lot of times at a very superficial or high level, if you're reading through it, you might think, oh yeah, I know that story. I read that somewhere before, maybe in Exodus or Numbers. I know that story. You know, oh, here's a story about the spies. I already know that story. I read it in Numbers 13 and 14. Oh, here. So people begin to think that it's merely repeating, rehearsing what's already come before. Now, the reason that they do that is, remember, Moses is old. We're in the 40th year, and this is the end of the end. The children of Israel are at a place called Shittim. They are prepared to cross over the Jordan. They are in the land of Moab, in the plains, the Aravot of Moab. They are there. They're prepared. Moses is about to die. He's already been told he's going to die. Joshua has already been appointed. And the book begins by telling us that these are the words that Moses spoke. So it's presented as sort of the valediction of Moses, as you will. It's his final goodbye. And he's going to give the people some words and some reminders, and he's going to rehearse, this is the standard view, what they need to know and what they really need to be focused on as they prepare to go across. But many people all along have noticed, now many people haven't, but particularly in the academic and the scholarly world, people have recognized, and in the rabbinic world, that Deuteronomy contains many, 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 many differences, different readings, different vocabulary, different phrases, different language, different details. If you read Deuteronomy and you compare it to other books, you're going to find those kind of things. The standard academic view is that Deuteronomy is late. The standard academic view is that it's a very late composition, that it is the latest of all the sources. Now, in the standard order of biblical books, one might also think that it's late. And chronologically, it is late in the sense that we're in the 40th year. So that idea of lateness stands out even within the text in some degrees, but they believe that it was composed latest. Now, let me explain this. We're going to be talking about some things as we work through this. We're going to be talking about some academic things. We're going to be talking about some fundamentalist views, but it's all going to work together so that we get a full picture of what exactly is this book. What is this greatest of all books of the Bible, according to me? Now, one of the reasons that they associate it with lateness is because they believe that it demonstrates within itself evidences of a 7th century BCE composition. What in the world does that mean? They believe that there is evidence in the text that this book, let's call it a book because it's what we use now. Back in the day, there weren't books in terms of like codex as we think of a book, but we'll call it a book or a writing, that most people believe that within this material written from the beginning to the end of Deuteronomy, what we have is evidence that puts it in the 7th century BCE. Now, I'm going to challenge a lot of even the academic approaches as we work through this, I promise you, if you stick with me. Now, one of the reasons that they associate it with that late date is they find within the book things that associate the language and the stories with the times of Hezekiah and Josiah. Now, Hezekiah is a little bit earlier, but his grandson Josiah, remember in Josiah, 2 Kings 22 and 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35, there's a book that's discovered. Most people agree that the book that was discovered was a form of Deuteronomy, but we'll get to that. But a lot of the scholars who look at this will say, you know, the language in that story in the 7th century BCE makes me think that that's when the book has its origin. Now, one of the main things that causes them to do that is because there is a congruence of words and phrases and actions with the language and laws that are found in Deuteronomy, which, by the way, the ones that I'm talking about are different than the language and laws of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Way different. But they do find a congruence, they find an association with the language of the 7th century BCE, particularly around that narrative of the discovery of the scroll in the days of Josiah by Hilkiah the high priest. And also the reformative actions that follow the discovery of this book in the days of Josiah by Hilkiah, the actions which follow that discovery seem to find their source in Deuteronomy. But what scholars begin to do is say it's the other way around. That the words of Deuteronomy are built because of the event that's described there. And this will make more sense as we get into this. Now, one of the many clues that makes the academic community move the book of Deuteronomy into the 7th century BCE and totally out of the time of Moses is because of something that we'll talk about in the series called cult centralization or centralization of worship. Deuteronomy brings into the Pentateuch something that is not known prior to Deuteronomy. And that is centralized worship. It's going to be, I'm going to go through some of these today even, but it's going to be several phrases that say that no longer can you do as the patriarchs did. You know, the patriarchs would build an altar and offer sacrifices. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Laban, you have all of these characters in these early periods who offered sacrifices anywhere and everywhere. Go back to Noah, and there wasn't a centralized place. But when you get to Deuteronomy, there is an emphasis on that has to be done in a certain place. That the temple cult that ultimately was established in Jerusalem, many believe that this was the ideal all along. Academics believe that it happened, and then the book of Deuteronomy was written to validate that or to justify or substantiate the move to Jerusalem. Some of the academic community have even alleged that the book of Deuteronomy is a fraud. It's called a pious fraud in one famous scholar's words, because he says that there wasn't a book that was found in the days of Josiah, but it was written in the days of Josiah. Again, he's making connections with the worldview on the ground in the 7th century BCE, and he says, wait a minute, there's too much of a connection between 7th century BCE, the reformative actions of Josiah, etc., and the way that Deuteronomy is written, so that he then put forward this idea that in order to advance the reform of Josiah, they needed a book. And they needed the book to claim, hey, Moses said we need to move all the sacrifices to Jerusalem. Look, it says right here, and everybody said, wow, sure does. Well, we never saw that before. That's because we just found it. This is their view. You understand, it's not my view, it's their view. Okay. Now, but there's a lot in Deuteronomy that we have to unpack. A lot. The traditional view of Deuteronomy, I propose, is also inadequate. I think the academic view of Deuteronomy is inadequate. I think it's wrong. I don't think it's right. But I also believe that the typical fundamentalist view of the text, the traditional view of Deuteronomy, is also wrong. And I'm going to say it that plainly, and I'm going to allow the text to back me up as we work through. The traditional view is that Moses wrote Deuteronomy and Moses wrote the whole of the Pentateuch as we possess them from Genesis 1 through Deuteronomy 34. I think that that is not correct. And we're going to talk about that today. I propose that to date, to this day, and I propose this with humility, that no model thus far presented accurately reflects the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I think that as often is the case, when sides express extreme views, that oftentimes the truth is somewhere in the middle. And we're going to look at that. So those on the extreme side, on the minimalist side, those who are on the minimalist side would say this. They would say, Moses probably never existed. And they would say, but if he did exist, if Moses did exist, I don't think he did, this is what they would say. The minimalists would say, I don't think he did, but if he did, he was probably illiterate. And therefore, nothing that we now possess can be traced with any confidence back to Moses. And I would add that these minimalists would ignore or not even consider any contrary evidence to their view. In other words, they believe he didn't exist, and if he did, he was illiterate. And if you say, yeah, but what about, they would say that we don't have any evidence. Now, conversely, the maximalist side, the extreme on that side, believe, yes, that Moses existed, yes, that he wrote Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34, and they would ignore any evidence that's contrary to their view. What kind of evidence that's contrary to their view, you might ask? How about this? How about contradictions? How about anachronisms, meaning things which a contemporary writer would not have written, things that clearly go in another period. The example that I often give is if someone in the time of Shakespeare said, Shakespeare, I really like your poem, it's groovy, man. Well, someone reading that today would say groovy. That's a term from the 60s. You know, they wouldn't have known that in that time. Well, we have such things in the biblical text, words and phrases which are clearly dated to a later period. We have anachronistic names in the biblical text. We have places that are mentioned in one place that they weren't known by that name until much later. Now again, we're talking, what I'm exposing here are indicators of authorship. When it was written, who wrote it, and what compelled them to write it. We're going to get into some of those things. The maximalist side is going to ignore problems with geography, which there are. and with other language-related issues. So the question that I begin with, what is the fifth book of the Pentateuch? What is it? What does it claim to be? Do we know if it had a title? I mean, we call it Deuteronomy, but I already showed at in my opening that the word Deuteronomy comes from really a misunderstanding, at least the way that they present it, a misunderstanding of Deuteronomy 17:18. Is that the name of the book? According to the Hebrew view, using the same verse, Mishneh HaTorah claims that Deuteronomy is a copy of the Torah. Now, is that correct? We're going to see. The book begins, a lot of ancient books, not only Hebrew books, but other books, name a book from the incipit, the opening lines or words of a book. And so in Hebrew, the book begins, Ele Hadevarim. These are the words, Ele Hadevarim Asher Diber Moshe. These are the words which Moses spoke. Is that the name of the book? Did it have a name, or was it just a record written by an author for a different purpose? And who was the author of Deuteronomy? Who wrote it? And for what purpose? Is it a single author? Was it Moses? Did Moses write Deuteronomy as the traditionalists claim? Or is it written by someone much later to pull the wool over someone's eyes, as some of the minimalists claim? Is the author of the book of Deuteronomy, as we call it, is this same author responsible for other work? Can we detect within this book evidences which make us associate it with the writer of another book? Again, the traditional view is that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Is there reason to believe that they reflect the same hand? Can we tell whether that's true or not? Now, if someone is saying, well, we know that because I've been told that, well, what does the text itself claim? Can we find traces of this author's hand, the one who penned parts or all of Deuteronomy? Can we find traces of the same hand in later books? In Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, in the prophets? Because there are a lot of views out there we'll get into that suggest such. Now the questions keep coming. Do we have evidence within the book of when the book of Deuteronomy was written? Was it written in the time of Moses during that wilderness period from the time, let's call it the Exodus period, from the time that they left Goshen until they get to the plains of Moab? Does the evidence support the claim of traditionalists that it's during this 40-year period, either at the beginning, in the middle, maybe continuously all the way through, and then at the end, or what? When is it written? Or again, was it written in the 7th century BCE? Perhaps to advance the Reformation of Josiah. So where was it written? When was it written? Who wrote it? Was it written, again, somewhere between Goshen and the plains of Moab? Or do we have evidence that Deuteronomy, in all or in part, is written once or by someone in the Promised Land, in the land of Canaan, west of the Jordan? Do we have any evidence that suggests that at least parts of it are written? Maybe it's both. That's why we have to go through. We have questions. We have questions that perplex each of us if we truly take another look. Now, look, I want to say this at this point. it would be much easier, I assure you, for many people if I just said, you know what you already believe is exactly right. Well, you don't even know what I believe, Ross. Yeah, you're right. Well, what if, it would be easier if I didn't challenge the traditional views. But years ago, I came to this place of seeking to understand and to implement and to really discover the true meaning of these texts. And I made a commitment that I would follow the evidence. And that's what I intend to do. So I do so with respect. Again, I'm not challenging traditional views. The Bible is. What you will find in the following weeks is a challenge to many things that you've accepted, but I'm going to let the Bible speak. So let's begin. We're going to start with an idea that Moses did not write the Pentateuch as we have it. And I'm just going to briefly touch these points because during the course of the next several weeks and months, actually, we're going to go through this very, very closely, very carefully, and we're going to show this from the text. But let me just say, the traditional view that Moses wrote Genesis 1 through Deuteronomy 34 is not supported by the text, and that's for a few reasons, or a few things really eliminate that as a possibility. And one of the main things is that Moses' name appears in the Pentateuch more than 592 verses. Some of those verses have his name more than once. So you might think, well, what does that prove? What I'm suggesting is that it is unlikely that a person would write in the third person. In other words, it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, and Moses and Aaron did this, and the Lord said this unto Moses, and Moses, see, it's as if it's written as if someone else is writing this story. The book of Genesis is a separate question. Genesis is something we'll get into in my next study series where I talk about the Pentateuch and how it became the book that we now have. But in this series, we're just talking about Deuteronomy. So I will say this, though, in terms of third person, the book of Genesis doesn't mention Moses because Moses, it's written as occurring before his time, right? We first encounter Moses in Exodus chapter 2. So Moses in Exodus occurs 261 times. In Leviticus, the name Moses occurs 80 times. In Numbers, Moses occurs 216 times. And in Deuteronomy, Moses occurs 35 times. 592 verses, not times, I should say verses, mention Moses in the third person as if someone else, who else? We don't know, but someone other than Moses is writing these 592 verses. Most naturally, one could almost safely decide that Moses didn't write these. Now, one can still argue, let me tell you this, one can still argue that someone else wrote these and that they accurately reflect the history. That's another argument, another discussion altogether. I'm talking about authorship. Who wrote this? Okay, now the question is, it's a side question, but it's related. Again, we'll just to make sure you keep these in front of you. The question is not only who wrote, but when were these things written? Now, some might argue that this use of third person is just a stylistic character of the text of the Bible. In other words, some might challenge and say, well, that's just the way he wrote. And the Lord spoke unto Moses. Moses says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses. Even though it would be more natural for you to think that Moses would say, and the Lord, or Jehovah, spoke unto me, saying. That's first person. So you would say, maybe they didn't write like that. Aha! But there are examples of that. There are examples of that. We do have examples of first-person narration. We do have examples of first-person narration. Remember I said that the name Moses occurs in 35 verses in Deuteronomy, but it's not always, those are in third person. I'm going to show you the difference in just a moment. But in Deuteronomy we have, and only in Deuteronomy do we have first-person narration. So let me give you some examples of third person, and you can do this just by opening and flipping your Bible. I'll give you a couple. Here's one. I mean, it's everywhere. Exodus 34:29. So Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and as Moses came down from the mountain, bearing the 2 tablets of the testimony or the pact, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant, since he had spoken with him. Aaron and all the Israelites saw that the skin of Moses' face was radiant, and they shrank from coming near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the chieftains in the assembly returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. Now, you have to think, would you naturally conclude that Moses wrote this if you weren't told that you had to believe that Moses wrote that? No. You would say somebody who's there. I mean, I'm okay with you holding that view, right? I mean, who am I? But it sounds like somebody's right there and they said, hey, Moses is coming down. He is? And Moses came down from the mountain. And as he came down from the mountain, his face was shiny. Okay? Look at chapter 35, verse 1, Exodus. Moses then convoked the whole Israelite community and said to them. How about chapter 36? Is it there? Yeah, look at verse 2. Moses then called Bezalel and Aholiab and every skilled person whom the Lord had endowed with skill, everyone who excelled in ability to undertake the task to carry it out. They took over from Moses all the gifts that the Israelites had. Sounds like somebody who is recording this, but not Moses. A couple more. Let's look and see if we find it in Leviticus. Well, Leviticus chapter 7, verse 22. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people thus, you shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goat. Fat from animals that died or were torn by beasts may be put to any use, but you must not eat it. All right, look at let's go to the next chapter, 8, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take Aaron along with his sons and the vestments and the anointing oil and the bull of the sin offering, the 2 rams in it. How about go a little bit further? Let's look at chapter 16, Leviticus 16:1. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the sons of Aaron who died when they drew too close to the presence of the Lord. The Lord said to Moses. You see my point? It would seem natural, more natural to say, and the Lord spoken, if Moses is writing it. Again, we're just talking about authorship. We're not talking about authenticity or inspiration, any of those things. Separate questions. Now, go with me to Deuteronomy. Remember, I said Deuteronomy has first person, but I'm going to show you it's not all first person. In fact, if you look at Deuteronomy, let's see, 4:41, Deuteronomy 4:41. Then Moses set aside 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan to which a manslayer could escape. Third person. All right, look at this, verse 44, chapter 4 of Deuteronomy. This is the teaching that Moses set before the Israelites. These are the decrees, laws, and rules that Moses addressed to the people of Israel. Third person. But let me show you something else. This only happens in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 1. Deuteronomy 1, verse 9. Thereupon I said to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. Jehovah your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May Jehovah, the God of your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? Does that sound like Moses? Sounds like him. Says it's him. Sounds like him. First person, look at verse 15. So I took your tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, and I appointed them heads over you, chiefs of thousands, chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of 50s, chiefs of 10s, and officials for your tribes. I charged your magistrates at that time as follows: hear out your fellow men and decide justly between any man and a fellow Israelite or a stranger. How about chapter 2? Let's see if it continues. Look at 2, verse 2. Then Jehovah said to me, you've been skirting this hill country long enough. Now turn north and charge the people as follows. I mean, it's clear, very clear, and it happens over and over and only in Deuteronomy. So for those who think that it's just a stylistic thing that a writer would write in the third person and not in the first person, and that is not the case. At times, we see the words of Moses with introductory material that is clearly from another hand. Look at Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy chapter 1, and I'm going to just read from the first few verses. Now listen to this. I want you to start thinking, is it most logical to think that Moses or another person wrote this? Listen. These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Through the wilderness in the Arava near Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, Hatzerot, and Dizahab. Sounds like somebody else to me. These are the words that Moses spoke. Now further, let me add this. Whoever's writing this is on the wrong side of the river. Remember this. We've talked about this. Whoever is writing this says he's on the west side of the Jordan. Now, I want you to get this. He's on the west side. Here's the Jordan. And he says, these are the words that Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. Clearly another hand. Clearly in another place. Writing about the words that Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. Look at verse 3. It was in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month that Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord had given him for them, after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtaroth and Edrei, on the other side of Jordan in the land of Moab. Moses undertook to expound this teaching. He said, I propose that this chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, is the hand of an editor, a redactor, someone other than Moses who is appending an introduction to the words of Moses. The original began like this. Are you ready? The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you stayed long enough at this mountain. Start out and make your way to the hill country and the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arava, etc. Look at verse 9 again. Thereupon I said to you. See, it's first person. The book that Moses wrote begins Not with Ele hadevarim asher diber Moshe, but the word begins, the Lord our God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, right? Chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, claim to be, they claim that what follows are the words of Moses, words that Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan before he died. Verse 6 begins the words of Moses. Now, we're going to point these kind of things out as we go. Now, you can dig your heels in if you choose and say, I prefer the traditional view. I feel more comfortable with that. The question is, is that, see, people a lot of times feel that they are doing the right thing by ascribing to Moses what he did not write. They think that it's more important to hold fast to a tradition than it is to make sense of a text. And I can tell you that that has thwarted many efforts to advance our understanding. It's stunted our growth, it's minimized our understanding, and it's kept us from finding the truth for far too long. Let's let the Bible tell us what it wants to tell us. You will learn to recognize in this study what is definitely written by another hand. You're going to be able to pick it up. You're going to be able to look at it and go, don't know who it is. Could be Joshua, might be Eleazar, might be Aaron, might be this person. You can put whatever you want to as a placeholder if you feel comfortable doing that. But the first thing is to determine what did and what did not, or what did Moses and what did Moses not write. Deuteronomy contains many, many different details. Many. We know this particularly when we take Deuteronomy and we put it side by side, which we are going to do all through this course. You're going to be best suited to get you a notebook and draw on pages 3 columns. And that way you can have a column for Exodus, a column for Numbers, and a column for Deuteronomy. In fact, I recommend that maybe I'll design a sheet, a simple Word document that you can use, and you can pencil in these verses to compare where this book of the Pentateuch covers a story, and that way you can look and point out the differences and the similarities between these different accounts. But these accounts are different. All right, episodes or events that are reported in Deuteronomy that are also covered by Exodus and Numbers. Watch, I'll give you a couple of examples. In the story of the spies, I'm just going to touch a few. This, again, is my introduction for the Deuteronomy study. The story of the so-called spies, Numbers chapter 13 and 14. If you read that, you get a lengthy narrative. And I just want to pick up one bit of it. Go to Numbers 13, verses 1 through 3. The Lord spoke to Moses, Numbers 13:1. The Lord spoke to Moses, first person or third person? Third person, saying, send men to scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelite people. Send one man from each of their ancestral tribes, each one a chieftain among them. So Moses, by the Lord's command, sent them out from the wilderness of Paran, all the men being leaders of the Israelites. Third person narrative. Moses, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses. It was the Lord's idea to send men to spy out the land according to Numbers. That's the way it's reported. Third person. Go with me to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 1. Now, a lot of people might not have noticed this. Here we go. Deuteronomy 1:22. Then all of you came to me and said, first person. This is Moses' account, according to the way I read it. Let us send men ahead to reconnoiter the land for us and bring back word on the route we shall follow and the cities we shall come to. I approved of the plan, and so I selected 12 of your men, one from each tribe. And they made for the hill country and came to the Wadi Eshkol and spied it out. Whose idea is it here? In Numbers 13, it's the Lord's idea. In Deuteronomy 1:22, it's the people's idea. They came to Moses and said, hey, we can do this. And he said, all right, I approve of that. Why didn't Moses get to go in the land? Can anybody tell me? Put your answer in the comments. Whose fault is it that he can't get into the land? If you read Numbers chapter 20, let's do that. Numbers chapter 20. And let's look at verse 10. Numbers 20, verse 10. Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? And Moses raised his hand, struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, third person, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. Those are the waters of Meribah. Meaning that the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, though he affirmed his sanctity, through which he affirmed his sanctity. Look at Numbers 27. I'm not going to read all this, but just get an idea. So in other words, Numbers, third person text, tells us that it's because they struck the rock, right? And then look at chapter 27 of Numbers, verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, ascend these heights of Avarim and view the land which I've given to the Israelite people. When you've seen it, you too shall be gathered to your kin, just as your brother Aaron was. For in the wilderness of Sin, when the community was contentious, you disobeyed my command to uphold my sanctity in their sight by means of the water. These are the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Sin. All right, again, you disobeyed the command. You didn't sanctify God. Now, Moses has an opportunity. Deuteronomy has an opportunity to tell us similarly why he's not allowed in the land. And let me see if I can find these. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 37. Because of you, Jehovah was incensed with me too, and he said, you shall not enter it either. Is Deuteronomy 1:37 a different way of saying what Numbers 20 and Numbers 27 says? Numbers 20 and Numbers 27 doesn't suggest at all that Moses is not allowed in because of the people. Numbers 20 and Numbers 27 says he can't go in because he disobeyed God. But Deuteronomy 1:37, first person, says God was incensed at him because of them. But that's not the only place. Go to chapter 3. Deuteronomy chapter 3. He brings it, he's really upset over this. And all three times he blames them. Look at Numbers chapter 3, verse 24. Let's see. Verse 23. And I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you who let your servant see the first works of your greatness and your mighty hand, you whose powerful deeds no God in heaven or on earth can equal, let me pray, cross over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, but that good hill country and the Lebanon. But the Lord was wrathful with me on your account and would not listen to me. The Lord said to me, enough, never speak to me of this matter again. Go up to the summit of Pisgah and gaze out to the west, the north, the south, the east. Look at it well, for you shall not go across yonder Jordan. Give Joshua his instructions, etc. Chapter 4, Deuteronomy, verse 21. Now the Lord was angry with me on your account and swore that I should not cross the Jordan and enter the good land that the Lord your God is assigning you as a heritage. For I must die in this land, I shall not cross the Jordan. But you'll cross and take possession of that good land. Now you might say, well, let's assume that the third person text is someone else writing and Deuteronomy reflecting first person. All right, maybe that's Moses and maybe he doesn't want to admit that he messed up. I don't know. But they're different. The reason he can't go in depends on what you read. The burden of leadership. In Exodus chapter 18, verse 13 through 27, you remember the story. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, sees Moses with people lined up. And he's there all day. And he asks him, what are you doing? And he tells him, well, I'm judging these cases. And Jethro tells him, you're going to get wore out on that. You can't do it that way. You're going to appoint, leaders over this group and smaller groups and let them handle the matters and let only the highest, most important, difficult matters rise to you. Otherwise, you're not going to sustain. You can't keep this up. And then in Deuteronomy 1:9, we're not going to read this. You put it in your notes. I'll get to this when we get to this in the class. Deuteronomy 1:9, Jethro isn't mentioned at all. Moses tells a similar story, same event, same episode. He tells it differently. In that, he mentions nothing about Jethro. He said, this is what I did. The ark. Would you agree that the ark is an important part of the biblical narrative? Go to Exodus 37. Exodus 37. And I want to read just a few verses here. Verse 1, Exodus 37, Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1.5 cubits high, overlaid it with pure gold inside and out, made a ring, made a gold molding for it cast 4 gold rings for its 4 feet, 2 rings on one side of its walls, 2 rings on the other, made poles of acacia wood, overlaid them with gold, inserted the poles and the rings on the side walls of the ark for carrying the ark. He made a cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide. Made 2 cherubim of gold. He covered them of hammered work of 2 ends of the cover, 1 cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end. He made the cherubim, the cheruvim as we say in Hebrew, of one piece with the cover at its 2 ends. Who made the ark? Bezalel, and he made it with golden images on the top. Deuteronomy chapter 10 also tells a story about the making of the ark. I've pointed this out every time. No need to stop now. I learned this. Dr. Tabor wrote an article on this. You can see it. I'll post a link, or maybe somebody can. Deuteronomy 10, let's read verses 1 through 5. Thereupon Jehovah said to me, notice first person, carve out 2 tablets of stone like the first, and come up to me on the mountain and make an ark of wood. I will inscribe on the tablets the commandments that were on the first tablet that you smashed, and you shall deposit them in the ark. I, first person, verse 3, I made an ark of acacia wood and carved out 2 tablets of stone like the first. I took the 2 tablets with me and went up on the mountain. The Lord inscribed on the tablets the same text as on the first, the 10 words that he addressed to you on the mountain out of the fire on the day of assembly, and the Lord gave them to me. Then I left and went down from the mountain, and I deposited the tablets in the ark that I had made, where they still are, as the Lord had commanded me. Cherubim, cheruvim, 38 times, 38 verses in the Tanakh. mention cherubim. 13 verses in the Pentateuch mention cherubim. Not a single one in Deuteronomy. Could be a coincidence. In fact, no angels at all in any form. You know, and some might argue that a keruv is not an angel, but whatever a keruv is, they're not mentioned in Deuteronomy, nor is any being associated with angel. There's no angel involved in any of this. Look at Exodus 14. Let me give you a couple of examples of what you'll find elsewhere in the Pentateuch. Exodus 14 and verse 19 says this. The angel of God who had been going ahead of the Israelite army now moved and followed behind them, and the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took place behind them. The angel of God there. Look at chapter 23 of Exodus. Exodus 23. Work with me here. We're going to go quickly through a couple of verses. Exodus 23 and verse 20. And it says, I am sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I've made ready. 23:20. Look at verse 23. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites, and I annihilate them, you shall not bow down to their gods and worship or follow their practices, but you shall tear down, smash their pillars to bits. Chapter 32 of Exodus. Sounds like a malak, an angel as it's translated, will be with them. And it's prevalent in the priestly sources. Exodus 32, 34. 32, 34. Go now. Let's see, is that the right one? 32, 34. Go now, lead the people where I told you. See, my angel shall go before you, but when I make an accounting, I will bring them to account for their sins. Now look at chapter 33 of Exodus. Verse 2, I will send an angel before you. I'll drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go in your midst, since you're a stiff-necked people, lest I destroy you on the way. Deuteronomy mentions no angel of any kind. Now, the Ark of the Testimony, remember, I want to show you differences between the way Deuteronomy tells stories and the way it's told in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, primarily. In the Ark is such a central piece, it's referred to as the Edut, the testimony, the Ark, the box, the chest of the testimony. The Edut occurs in 38 verses in the Tanakh. Very, very significant Hebrew word. 32 of those times are in the Pentateuch. Never, not once, does the word Edut occur in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy refers to it as the covenant chest, or the chest of the covenant, or the ark of the covenant, if you choose to translate Aron as ark. But Aron is a chest, it's a box. The chest, according to Deuteronomy, the chest is not called the Edut, the testimony. The stone tablets which are inside it are called, in Deuteronomy, the covenant. The covenant. In other books, it's called the covenant, very seldom, but it is. But it's referred to as the Edut, the testimony. But some people don't understand what testimony is. According to priestly writers, the testimony is the two tablets. It's not the two tablets and the blessings and the curses. It's not the two tablets and anything else. It's the two tablets. That's all it is. But the two tablets are called the covenant. They're not called the Edut in Deuteronomy. The tabernacle, the tent, we have words used in the Pentateuch for the central place of worship in the wilderness period. And they are the Mikdash, 72 verses in the Tanakh. The Mikdash. Mikdash is typically translated, I think, as sanctuary or maybe a holy place. Mikdash, 72 times in the Tanakh, never in Deuteronomy. It's not mentioned. Mishkan. Mishkan is the typically translated the tabernacle. It's from the root shechan, which means to dwell. You've heard of the Shekinah, or as we say it in the South, the Shekinah glory. But the Shekinah, the Mishkan, is very important. It's mentioned more than 70 verses, not once in Deuteronomy. The Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, 140 verses in the Tanakh, 129 verses in the Pentateuch. It's mentioned one time in Deuteronomy, and I'll tell you about that in a future class. Priests and Levites. Everyone knows that to function as a priest, you can't just be a Levite. You have to be a son of Aaron. Everybody knows that. Now, there are difficult things in the Bible that challenge that, but people push those away. So they like the consistency that they find in the majority of texts, which suggests that only descendants of the sons of Aaron can be priests. Is that what's reflected in Deuteronomy? Good question. The sons of Aaron, B'nai Aharon, the sons of Aaron are mentioned 62 times in the Tanakh, 38 times in the Pentateuch. Never, not one time in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, instead of reading about the sons of Aaron, we read about Levitical priest. And it uses that phrase all the time. And it's just striking that in Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus, you would expect, it kind of builds the pattern that you'll see the priest, the sons of Aaron. The sons of Aaron, the priest. B'nai Aharon, Haleviim, the Levites, the sons of... You're going to see that all together. Never, not one time in Deuteronomy. I'll give you a couple of examples here. In Deuteronomy, this is what you see. Go to Deuteronomy 17, and let's see, I think it's verse 9. And appear before the Levitical priest or the magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem. Look down at verse 18 of Deuteronomy 17. 18. When he is seated on his throne, hey, we already read this. He shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priest. Very interesting. But again, we're going to go into this in greater detail in the classes to come. Speaking of Aaron, Aaron is mentioned in 328 verses in the Tanakh, 286 times in the Pentateuch. And by Pentateuch, I mean Exodus through Deuteronomy, because Genesis doesn't have Aaron, right? He's born later, he's mentioned later. But either way, 286 times in the Pentateuch. Guess how many times he's mentioned in Deuteronomy? 3 times. All 3 times deal with either his crime, with the calf, or with his death. And by the way, in one of the passages about his death, it puts the death and burial at a different place than you find in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It says in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers that he dies at Mount Hor and is buried at Mount Hor. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 6 says that he dies and is buried at Mosera. We talked about that before. Interesting. Deuteronomy is different. These are just differences. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have answers. I'm presenting to you some of the difficult things that we have to unpack over the next several weeks. We have to answer these questions. Why do these differences exist? Why is it that circumcision of the foreskin, circumcision of the flesh, is mentioned in the Pentateuch in other places, but in Deuteronomy, the only circumcision that is mentioned, and it's mentioned twice, is circumcision of heart. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 16, and Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 6. It's the only circumcision mentioned. It's also interesting when we talk about circumcision, as we get to that idea in our forthcoming study, it's also interesting that when we look at this particular subject, that there was no circumcision during the 40 years in the wilderness. None. Now, is it required or is it not required, and why wasn't it? And why in Exodus chapter 4 did Moses not have his son circumcised? Why is it that we get this strange episode of an angel, third person, we assume is going to kill either Moses or the child? It's kind of hard. Remember, Zipporah cuts off the foreskin and throws it and calls him a bridegroom of blood. Why? What is going on here? How about the kavod Yehovah, the glory of the Lord, as it's translated, kavod Adonai, very, very frequently used phrase in the priestly material, but it never occurs in Deuteronomy. Kavod Yehovah. Can you see God or can you not see God? Go with me to Exodus 24. Can you see God or can you not see God? Exodus 24. See, by the way, it is easier if you just go along with what the traditionalists say and never question anything. It's a lot more popular. All right, here we go. 24, Exodus, verse 1. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, the 70 elders of Israel, and bow low from afar. Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Moses went and repeated to the people all the commands of the Lord, all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the things that the Lord has commanded we'll do. Moses then wrote down all the commands of the Lord. Early in the morning, he set up an altar at the foot of the mountain and the 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. He designated some young men among the Israelites, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took one part of the blood, put it in the basins, put the other part of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took a record of the covenant, read it aloud to the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will faithfully do. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you concerning all these commands. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel ascended, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was the likeness of pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Yet he did not raise his hand against the leaders of Israel. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. Now, at this point, people trying to reconcile this and what I'm about to read say, well, it's a vision, it's not real, it's not. Because they want to make the two fit. In this passage, third person, Moses and the elders see God. All right, now go Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4. And let's start in verse 9, I think. Verse 9. But take utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously, so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children, to your children's children. The day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on earth, and may so teach their children. You came forward and stood at the foot of the mountain. Mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark with densest clouds. The Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a voice. He declared to you the covenant that he commanded you to observe, the 10 words, and he inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone. At the same time, the Lord commanded me to impart to you laws and rules for you to observe in the land that you're about to cross into and occupy. For your own sake, therefore, be most careful, since you saw no shape when the Lord your God spoke to you at Horeb out of fire. not to act wickedly and make for yourself a sculptured image in any likeness whatsoever, the form of a man or a woman, the form of any beast on earth, the form of any winged bird that flies in the sky, form of anything that creeps on the ground, the form of any fish that's in the waters below the earth. And when you look up to the sky, behold the sun and the moon and the stars and the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them. These the Lord your God allotted to other people everywhere under heaven, but you, the Lord, took and brought you out of Egypt, that iron blast furnace, to be his very own people, as is now the case. Deuteronomy never has an account of anyone seeing God. It's not part of it. He stresses over and over, you heard, listen, you heard, you didn't see, you don't see, so you don't make very, very clear and consistent. Other parts of the Bible, particularly the Pentateuch, have hard to explain passages about seeing God. Not in Deuteronomy. It says here that God, the one that took them out of the iron furnace, by the way, iron furnace only used in Deuteronomy. And it's also found in some of the prophets, but it's only Deuteronomy. Why is that? Here's some other phrases and words that are only used in Deuteronomy that I jotted down. In the place that he will choose, 11 times, 11 verses say in the place that he will choose, all in Deuteronomy. Why is that? Lengthen days in the land. 8 times, 8 verses, all Deuteronomy. With all heart and with all soul, 9 verses, all Deuteronomy. Walk after other gods. That phrase, walk after other gods, it occurs only in Deuteronomy. 5 verses. Turn and serve other gods. He's talking about their crime of turning and serving other gods. It's mentioned 11 times. Very, very important in Deuteronomy. Mentioned nowhere else. Listen to the voice of God. The command, listen to the voice of God. 34 verses in the Tanakh, 12 verses in the Pentateuch, only in Deuteronomy. But there's more. We have 2 versions of the 10 words. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. They read differently. Dietary rules. Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14. Different. Blessing, now a lot of similarities, but they read differently, okay? And you may say, well, there's no, so what? Well, we're going to look at these things because we're going to examine the text horizontally and make some observations and see, all right? The blessings and the curses in Leviticus 26, do they match Deuteronomy 27 and 28? No, they don't. They're different. Did you know that the love of and for God is only found in Deuteronomy? Leviticus doesn't mention grace, mercy, forgiveness. It's all ritual. A lot of people love that ritual stuff. That has nothing to do with love. You know, the people who love the ritual stuff often will say, what's love got to do with it? It's just obedience, just, well, I'm kind of a lover, me. But we're going to talk about that. Indeed, Deuteronomy is different. We have to ask why. We have to ask who wrote it, when, where. Why is it that Deuteronomy is the only book of the 5 that contains first-person narration? But remember, not all of Deuteronomy is first-person narration. We have to actually go through and make some calls. We have to say, this is clearly the hand of a narrator. This could be written later. This could be written in another place. This, on the other hand, seems to be perhaps Moses, maybe written in the wilderness. We'll be able to tell the difference if we read it. What can we learn from a careful study of the words of Deuteronomy? Is it possible that we can find answers to questions that have perplexed scholars and sages Could we find the answers? Would you join me on a new look at Deuteronomy? Join me next Saturday, same time, same channel. Don't miss a single one of these. They're going to be live streamed on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. They'll be uploaded as not only video, but they'll be uploaded later as audio podcast, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. But listen to me, don't miss a single one of these classes. If you really want to know what are the words of Moses, don't miss it. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.